All right, good morning, boys and girls. Welcome to day 6. Those of you that I got to talk to either through FaceTime or over the phone, it was nice to hear from you and get to discuss the books with you guys. Sounds like you guys doing pretty well overall with some of the questions, those that talked. Those that decided not to talk to me or FaceTime me, that's okay too. Miss you guys too. Um, so let's go ahead and get started on day 6. We are on chapter 5. We just left off with chapter 4. Remember, Ralph and Jack got into a little scuffle. Piggy got his glasses broke. Might be a little hint as to things that are upcoming, but we will find out. So, chapter 5, Beast from Water, page 76 for those of you that haven't found it yet. The tide was coming in, and there was only a narrow strip of firm beach between the water and the white, stumbling stuff near the palm terrace. Ralph chose the firm strip as a path because he needed to think, and only here he could allow his feet to move without having to watch them. Suddenly, pacing by the water, he was overcome with astonishment. He found himself understanding the wearisomeness of this life, and where every path was an improvisation, and a considerable part of one's walking life was spent watching one's feet. He stopped, facing the strip, and remembering that the first enthusiastic exploration, as though it were part of a brighter childhood, he smiled jeeringly. He turned then and walked back toward the platform with the sun in his face. The time had come for the assembly. As he walked into the concealing splendors of sunlight, he went carefully over the points of his speech. There must be no mistake about this assembly, no chasing imaginary. Remember at the end of chapter 4, he said he was calling for an assembly. He lost himself in a maze of thoughts that were rendered vague by his lack of words to express them. Frowning, he tried again. This meeting was not to be fun, but business. At that he walked faster, aware all at once of urgency in the declining sun and a little wind created by his speed that breathed about his face. The wind pressed his gray shirt against his chest so that he noticed, in this new mood of comprehension, how the folds were stiff like cardboard and unpleasant. Noticed too how the frayed edges of his shorts were making an uncomfortable pink area on the front of his thighs. With a convulsion of the mind, Ralph discovered dirt and decay, understood how much he disliked perpetually flicking the tangled hair out of his eyes, and at last, when the sun was gone, rolling noisily to rest among dry leaves. At that he began to trot. The beach near the bathing pool was dotted with groups of boys waiting for the assembly. They made way for him silently, conscious of his grim mood, and fought at the fire. The place of assembly in which he stood was roughly a triangle, but irregular and sketchy, like everything they made. First there was a log on which he himself sat, a dead tree that must have been quite exceptionally big for the platform. Perhaps one of those legendary storms of the Pacific had shifted it here. This palm tree lay parallel to the beach, so that when Ralph sat he faced the island, but to the boys was a darkish figure against the shimmer of the lagoon. The two sides of the triangle, of which the log was base, were less evenly defined. On the right was a log polished by restless seats along the top, but not so large as the chief's and not so comfortable. On the left were 4 small logs, one of them, the farthest, lamentably springy. Assembly after assembly had broken up in laughter when someone had leaned too far back, and the log had whipped and thrown half a dozen boys backwards into the grass. Yet now he saw no one had the wit, not himself, nor Jack, nor Piggy, to bring a stone and a wedge thing, so they would continue enduring the ill-balanced twister because, again, he lost himself in deep waters. Grass was worn away in front of each trunk, but grew tall and untrodden in the center of the triangle. Then, at the apex, the grass was thick again because no one sat there. All around the place of assembly the gray trunks rose, straight or leaning, and supported the low roof of the leaves. On two sides was the beach behind the lagoon, in front the darkness of the island. Ralph turned to the chief's seat. They had never had an assembly as late before. That was why the place looked so different. Normally, the underside of the green roof was lit by a tangle of golden reflections, and their faces were lit upside down, like, thought Ralph, when you hold an electric torch in your hands. But now the sun was slanting in at one side, so that the shadows were there. So the shadows were where they ought to be. Again, he fell into a strange mood of speculation that was so foreign to him. If faces were different when lit from above or below, what was a face? What was anything? Ralph moved impatiently. The trouble was, if you were a chief, you had to think. You had to be wise. And then the occasion slipped by so that you had to grab at a decision. This made you think because thought was a valuable thing that got results. Only, decided Ralph as he faced the chief's seat, I can't think, not like Piggy. Once more that evening Ralph had to adjust his values. Piggy could think. He could go step by step inside that fat head of his. Only Piggy was no chief. But Piggy, for all his ludicrous body, had brains. Ralph was a specialist in thought now, and could imagine thought in another. The sun in his eyes reminded him how the time was passing. So he took the conch down from the tree and examined the surface. Exposure to the air had bleached the yellow and pink to near white and transparency. Ralph felt kind of affectionate reverence for the conch, even though he had fished the thing out of the lagoon himself. He faced the place of assembly and put the conch to his lips. The others were waiting for this. Bottom of 78. The others were waiting for this and came straight away. Those who were aware that a ship had passed the island while the fire was out were subdued by the thought of Ralph's anger, while those, including the little ones, who did not know, were impressed by the general air of solemnity. The place of assembly filled quickly. Jack, Simon, Maurice, most of the hunters on Ralph's right, the rest on the left under the sun. Piggy came and stood outside the triangle. This indicated that he wished to listen, but would not speak, and Piggy intended it as a gesture of disapproval. The thing is, we need an assembly. No one said anything, but the faces turned to Ralph were intent. He flourished the conch. He had learnt as a practical business that fundamental statements like this had to be said at least twice before everyone understood them. One had to sit, attracting all eyes to the conch, and drop words like heavy round stones among the little groups that crouched or squatted. He was searching his mind for simple words so that even the little ones would understand what the assembly was about. Later, perhaps, practiced debaters, Jack, Maurice, Piggy, would use their whole art to twist the meeting. But now, at the beginning of the subject of the debate, the debate must be laid out clearly. We need an assembly, not for fun, not for laughing and falling off the log. The group of little ones on the twister giggled and looked at each other. Not for making jokes or for he lifted the conch in an effort to find the compelling words. For cleverness. Not for these things, but to put things straight. He paused for a moment. I've been alone, by myself. I went, thinking what's what. I know what we need, an assembly to put things straight. And first of all, I'm speaking. He paused for a moment and automatically pushed back his hair. Piggy tiptoed to the triangle, his effectual protest made, and joined the others. Ralph went on. We have lots of assemblies. Everybody enjoys speaking and being together. We decide things, but they don't get done. We were going to have water brought from the stream and left in those coconut shells under the fresh leaves. So it was, for a few days. Now there's no water. The shells are dry. People drink from the river. There was a murmur of assent. Not that there's anything wrong with drinking from the river. I mean, I'd sooner have water from the place you know, the pool where the waterfall is, than out of an old coconut shell. Only we said we'd have the water brought, and now not. There were only 2 full shells there this afternoon. He licked his lips. Then there's huts, shelters. Their murmur swelled again and died away. You mostly sleep in shelters. Tonight, except for Sam and Eric, up by the fire, you'll all sleep there. Who built the shelters? Clamor rose at once. Everyone had built the shelters. Ralph had to wave the conch once more. Wait a minute, who built all 3? We all built the first one, 4 of us the second one, and me and Simon built the last one over there. That's why it's so tottery. No, don't laugh. That shelter might fall down if the rain comes back. We'll need those shelters then. He paused and cleared his throat. There's another thing. We chose those rocks right along beyond the bathing pool as a lavatory. That was sensible, too. The tide cleans up the place. You little ones know about that. There were sniggers here and there and swift glances. Now, people seem to use anywhere, even near the shelters and the platform. You little ones, when you're getting fruit, you're taking short. If you're taking short, the assembly roared. I said, if you're taking short, you keep away from the fruit. That's dirty. Laughter rose again. I said, that's dirty. He plucked at his stiff gray shirt. That's really dirty. If you're taking short, you go right along the beach to see the rocks. See? Piggy held out his hand for the conch, but Ralph shook his head. His speech was planned, point by point. We've all got to use the rocks again. This place is getting dirty. He paused. The assembly, sensing a crisis, was tensely expectant. And then, about the fire, Ralph let out his spare breath with a little gasp that was echoed by his audience. Jack started to chip a piece of his wood with his knife and whispered something to Robert, who looked away. The fire is the most important thing on the island. How can we ever be rescued, except by luck, if we don't keep a fire going? Is a fire too much to add for us to make? He flung out an arm. Look at us. How many are we? And yet we can't keep a fire going to make smoke? You don't understand. Can't you see we ought to die before we let the fire out? There was a self-conscious giggling among the hunters. Ralph turned on them passionately. You hunters, you can laugh, but I tell you the smoke is more important than the pig. However often you kill one, do all of you see? He spread his arms wide and turned to the whole triangle. We've got to make smoke up there or die. He paused, feeling for the next point. Oh, thank you. And another thing, someone called out. Too many things. There came a mutter of agreement. Ralph overrode them. And another thing. We nearly set the whole island on the fire. And we waste time rolling rocks and making little cooking fires. Now I say this and make it a rule. Because I'm chief. We won't have a fire anywhere but on the mountain. Ever. There was a row immediately. Boys stood up and shouted, and Ralph shouted back. Because if you want a fire to cook fish or crab, you can jolly well go up the mountain. That way we'll be certain. Hands were reaching for the conch in light of the setting sun. He held on and leapt on the trunk. All this I meant to say. Now I've said it. You voted me for chief. Now you do what I say. They quieted slowly, and at last were seated again. Ralph dropped down and spoke in his ordinary voice. So remember, The rocks for a lavatory. Keep the fire going and smoke showing as a signal. Don't take fire from the mountain. Take your food up there. Jack stood up, scowling in gloom, and held out his hands. I haven't finished yet, but you've talked and talked. I've got the conch. Jack sat down, grumbling. Then the last thing. This is what people can talk about. We waited till the platform was very still. Things are breaking up. I don't understand why. We began well, we were happy, and then he moved the conch gently, looking beyond them as nothing, remembering the beastie, the snake, the fire, the talk of fear. Then people started getting frightened. A murmur, almost a moan, rose and passed away. Jack had stopped whittling. Ralph went on abruptly. But that's Littleland's talk. We'll get that straight. So the last part, the bit we can talk about, is a kind of deciding on the fear. The hair was creeping to his eyes again. We've got to talk about this fear and decide there's nothing in it. I'm frightened myself sometimes, only that's nonsense, like bogies. Then, when we've decided, we can start again and be careful about things like the fire. A picture of 3 boys walking along the bright beach flitted through his mind. And be happy. Ceremonially, Ralph laid the conch on the trunk beside him as a sign that the speech was over. What sunlight reached them was level. Jack stood up and took the conch. So this is a meeting to find out what's what. I'll tell you what's what. You little ones started all this with the fear talk. Beast. Where from? Of course we're frightened sometimes, but we put up with being frightened. Only Ralph says you scream in the night. What does that mean but nightmares? Anyway, you don't hunt or build or help. You're a lot of crybabies and sissies. That's why. And as for the fear, you'll have to put up with it like the rest of us. Ralph looked at Jack open-mouthed, but Jack took no notice. The thing is, fear can't hurt you any more than a dream. There aren't any beasts to be afraid of on this island. He looked along the row of whispering little ones. Serve you right if something did get you, you useless lot of crybabies, but there is no animal. Ralph interrupted him testily. What is all of this? Who said anything about an animal? You did, the other day. You said that they dream and cry out. Now they talk, not only the little ones, but my hunters sometimes talk of a thing, a dark thing, a beast, some sort of animal. I've heard. You thought not, didn't you? Now listen, you don't get big animals on small islands, only pigs. You only get lions and tigers in big countries like Africa and India, and the zoo. I've got the conch. I'm not talking about the fear. I'm talking about the beast. Be frightened if you like. But as for the beast, Jack paused, cradling the conch, and turned to his hunters with their dirty black caps. Am I a hunter or am I not? They nodded simply. He was a hunter, all right. No one doubted that. Well then, I've been all over this island by myself. If there were a beast, I'd have seen it. Be frightened because you're like that, but there is no beast in the forest. Jack handed back the conch and sat down. The whole assembly applauded him with relief. Then Piggy held out his hand. I don't agree with all Jack said, but with some. Of course there isn't a beast in the forest. How could there be? What would a beast eat? Pig? We eat pig. Piggy. I got the conch, said Piggy indignantly. Ralph, they ought to shut up, oughtn't they? You shut up, you little ones. What I mean is that I don't agree about this here fear. Of course there isn't nothing to be afraid of in the forest. Why, I've been there myself. You'll be talking about ghosts and such things. We know what goes on, and if there's something wrong, there's someone to put it right. He took off his glasses and blinked at them. The sun had gone as if the light had been turned off. He proceeded to explain. If you get a pain in your stomach, whether it's a little one or a big one, George is a big one. When you done laughing, perhaps we can get on with the meeting. And if them little ones climb back on the twister again, they'll only fall off in a sec. So they might as well sit on the ground and listen. No, you have doctors for everything, even the inside of your mind. You don't really mean that we got to be frightened all the time of nothing. Life, said Piggy expansively, is scientific. That's what it is. In a year or two, when the war's over, they'll be traveling to Mars and back. I know there isn't no beast, not with claws and all that, I mean, but I know there isn't no fear either. Piggy unpaused. Unless, Ralph moved restlessly, unless what? Unless we get frightened of people. A sound, half laugh, half jeer, rose among the seated boys. Piggy ducked his head and went on hastily. So let's hear from the little one who talked about a beast, and perhaps we can show him how silly he is. The little ones began to jabber among themselves. Then one stood forward. What's your name? Phil. For a little one, he was self-confident, holding out his hands, cradling the conch as Ralph did, looking around at them to collect their attention before he spoke. Last night I had a dream, a horrid dream, fighting with things. I was outside the shelter by myself, fighting with things, those twisty things in the trees. He paused, and the other little ones laughed in horrified sympathy. Then I was frightened, and I woke up, and I was outside the shelter by myself, and the dark and twisty things had gone away. The vivid horror of this, so possible and so nakedly terrifying, held them all silent. The child's voice went piping on from behind the white conch, and I was frightened and started to call out for Ralph, and then I saw something moving among the trees, something big and horrid. He paused, half frightened by the recollection, yet proud of the sensation he was creating. That was a nightmare, Ralph said. He was walking in his sleep. The assembly murmured in subdued agreement. The little one shook his head stubbornly. I was asleep when the twisty things were fighting, and when they went away, I was awake, and I saw something big and horrid moving in the trees. Ralph held out his hands for the conch, and the little one sat down. You were asleep. There wasn't anyone there. How could anyone be... Sorry. How could anyone be wandering about in the forest at night? Was anyone? Did anyone go out? There was a long pause while the assembly grinned at the thought of anyone going out into the darkness. Then Simon stood up, and Ralph looked at him in astonishment. You! What were you mucking about in the dark for? Simon grabbed the conch convulsively. I wanted to go to a place I know. What place? Just a place I know, a place in the jungle. He hesitated. Jack settled the question for them with a contempt in his voice that could sound so funny and so final. He was taken short. With a feeling of humiliation on Simon's behalf, Ralph took back the conch, looking Simon sternly in the face as he did. Well, don't do it again. Understand? Not at night. That's enough silly talk about these beasts. Without the little ones seeing you gliding about like a... The derisive laughter that rose had fear in it and condemnation. Simon opened his mouth to speak, but Ralph had the conch, so he backed to his seat. When the assembly was silent, Ralph turned to Piggy. Well, Piggy, there was another one. Him. The little ones pushed Percival forward and left him by himself. He stood knee-deep in the central grass, looking at his hidden feet, trying to pretend that he was in a tent. Ralph remembered another small boy who had stood like this, and he flinched away from the memory. He had pushed the thought down and out of sight. where only some positive reminder like this could bring it to the surface. There had been no further numberings of the little ones, partly because there were no means of ensuring that all of them were accounted for, and partly because Ralph knew the answer to at least one question Piggy had asked on the mountaintop. There were little boys, fair, dark, freckled, and all dirty, but their faces were all dreadfully free of major blemishes. No one had seen the mulberry-colored birthmark again, but that time Piggy had coaxed and bullied tacitly admitting that he remembered the unmentionable. Ralph not to pity. Go on, ask him. Piggy knelt, holding the cock. Now then, what's your name? The small boy twisted away into his tent. Piggy turned helplessly to Ralph, who spoke sharply. What's your name? Tormented by the silence and the refusal, the assembly broke into chant. What's your name? What's your name? Quiet! Ralph peered as a child in the twilight. Now tell us, what's your name? Percival Wemyss Madison. The Vicarage, Harcourt Street. Anthony Hance. Telephone. And this is the information was rooted far down in the springs of sorrow. The little one wept. His face puckered. The tears leapt from his eyes. His mouth opened till they could see a square black hole. At first, he was silent. He was a silent effigy of sorrow. But then the lamentation rose out of him, loud and sustained as the conch. Shut up, you. Shut up. Percival Wemyss Madison would not shut up. A spring had been tapped, far beyond the reach of authority or even physical intimidation. The crying went on, breath after breath, and seemed to sustain him upright as if he were nailed to it. Shut up. Shut up. For now the little ones were no longer silent. They were reminded of their personal sorrows, and perhaps felt themselves to share in a sorrow that was universal. They began to cry in sympathy, two of them almost as loud as Percival. Maurice saved them. He cried out, Look at me! He pretended to fall over. He rubbed his rump and sat on the twister so that he fell in the grass. He clowned badly, but Percival and the others noticed and sniffed and laughed. Presently, they were all laughing so absurdly that the big uns joined in. Jack was the first to make himself heard. He had not got the conch, and thus spoke again against the rules, but nobody minded. And what about the beast? Something strange was happening to Percival. He yawned and staggered, so that Jack seized and shook him. Where does the beast live? Percival sagged into Jack's grip. That's a clever beast, said Piggy, jeering. If it can't hide on this island. Jack's been everywhere. Where could a beast live? Beast my foot. Percival muttered something, and the assembly laughed again. Ralph leaned forward. What does he say? Jack listened to Percival's answer and then let go of him. Percival, released, surrounded by the comfortable presence of humans, fell in the long grass and went to sleep. Jack cleared his throat, then reported casually. The last laugh died away. Ralph turned involuntarily, a black humped figure against the lagoons. The assembly looked with him, considered the vast stretches of water, the high sea beyond. Unknown indigo of infinite possibility, heard silently the sough and whisper from the reef. Maurice spoke so loudly that they jumped. Daddy said they haven't found all the animals in the sea yet. Argument started again. Ralph held out the glimmering conch, and Maurice took it obediently. The meeting subsided. I mean, when Jack says you can be frightened because people are frightened anyway, that's all right. But when he says there's only pigs on the island, I expect he's right, but he doesn't know. Not really. Not certainly, I mean. Maurice took a breath. My daddy says there's things. What'd you call them that make ink squids? That are hundreds of yards long and eat whales whole. He paused again and laughed easily. I don't believe that there is a beast of a creature, of course. As Piggy says, life's scientific, but we don't know, do we? Not certainly, I mean, someone shouted. A squid couldn't come up out of the water. Couldn't. In a moment, the platform was full of arguing, gesticulating shadows. To Ralph, seated, this seemed the breaking up of sanity. Fear, beast, no general agreement that the fire was all important, and when the one tried to get the thing straight, the argument sheared off, bringing up fresh, unpleasant matter. He could see a whiteness in the gloom near him, so he grabbed it from Maurice and blew as loudly as he could. The assembly was shocked into silence. Simon was close to him, laying hands on the conch. Simon felt a perilous necessity to speak, but to speak in assembly was a terrible thing to him. Maybe, he said hesitantly, maybe there is a beast. The assembly cried out unsavagely as Ralph stood up in amazement. You, Simon, you believe in this? I don't know, said Simon. His heartbreaks were choking him. But the storm broke. Sit down. Shut up. Take the cart. Sod you. Shut up, Ralph shouted. Hear him. He's got the cart. What I mean is, maybe it's only us. Nuts. That was from Piggy. Shocked out of the decorum, Simon went up. We could be sort of... Simon became inarticulate in his efforts to express mankind's essential illness. Inspiration came to him. What's the dirtiest thing there is? And as an answer, Jack dropped into the uncomprehending silence that followed in the one crude, expressive syllable. Release was immense. Those little ones who had climbed back on the twister fell off again and did not mind. The hunters were screaming with delight. Simon's effects fell about him in the ruins. The laughter beat him cruelly, and he shrank away defenseless to his seat. At last, the assembly was silent again. Some spoke out of turn. Maybe he means it's some sort of ghost? Ralph lifted the conch and peered into the gloom. The lightest thing was the pale beach. Surely the little ones were the lightest thing that was pale. Surely the little ones were near. Yes, there was no doubt about it. They were huddled into a tight knot of bodies in the central grass. A flurry of wind made the plum tree talk, and most of the noise very loud. Now that darkness and silence made it so noticeable. All right, guys, I'm going to stop right there because we talked today. So I'm going to stop right there at the top of page 90. So we got about 5 more pages of this chapter left, and then we'll get into chapter 6. So, any questions, comments, concerns? Awesome. So, I will see you back tomorrow, top of page 90. See ya.